our ethical behavior, or I guess how ethical our behavior is influenced by a wide variety of factors, including our own current mental states or our mood. So there have been various studies suggesting, for instance, that people tend to behave much more altruistically. So they're more willing to, go out of their way to benefit others, to help others when they're in a positive mood. So you're feeling good, and that somehow plays a large role in determining whether you're going to, go out of your way to help another person. When people feel, by contrast, like their own well-being is under threat, or they're suffering, they seem to become less considerate of others, or at least there's various studies that suggest this. And in both of those cases, so whether you're feeling good or you're feeling bad, there's some evidence that the behavior, so that the good ethical behavior or the bad ethical behavior, and the good or bad mental state are sort of mutually reinforcing.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us again on AskHowAbout. I'm your host, well, you should know by now, Pranay J. Reddy. Today, we're going to have an interesting discussion and a philosophical talk on wellness. Now, wellness, this term is pretty broad. So let me just, narrow it down a bit for you. So in this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into what wellness or being well is all about, the factors which affect it, and also how you being well affects 10 other people next to you. So it's pretty important, and especially during this year 2020. Now, I'd like to point out that I've started many of my videos saying especially during this year 2020. You can take a look back, but it is goddamn 2020, and for all the negative tones, we still have to have a positive spin on it, because us being well, us being positive will make your life better, make your year better, and in consequence make others' life better as well. Now again, that's easier said than done, but it's worth taking a look into what actually goes into being well. So, we brought an expert today, Dr. Joseph Van Weelden, to talk about the philosophy of well-being.
He is a philosopher who specializes in ethics and well-being. His research areas include well-being, axiological commitments of desire, satisfaction accounts, the nature and appeal of subjectivism, and the relationship between well-being at a time and well-being over an entire lifespan. Now that's a bit about our guest. Let's get on with the show.
Dr. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing, sir? How are you doing this post-lockdown time?
I'm doing well, yes. Thank you very much for the invitation. I am looking forward to speaking with you today about a variety of issues, I think, related to ethics and well-being and our current situation.
Yeah, definitely. Because one thing which is a common pattern this post-lockdown during this year, let's just take 2020 in a nutshell. It's a erratic year. It's like, things happening everywhere. There's no one static place where you can take a breath and be like, cool, I can relax for a moment. But it's 2020 hasn't given us that opportunity, but that has affected us in many different ways, not just with the pandemic, but with so many social justice issues rising as well across nations. So that's why I thought it'd be important for us to discuss about well-being or wellness, rather the philosophy of wellness. So how would you define being well or wellness?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that there's no uncontroversial, universally agreed upon definition of well-being among philosophers, which I think that's not surprising, because if philosophers are experts at anything, it's disagreeing with other philosophers. But so I'll make an attempt to sort of try to clarify the notion a little bit. So maybe the first thing I'll say, maybe the closest you can give to a straight definition, is that well-being is something like a kind of overall or holistic assessment of how well a life is going for the person living it. So for philosophers, this is sort of a broader notion than physical health or mental health, or economic well-being or something like this. It's just the broadest possible idea of how well is the life going for you. So when you think about the constituents of well-being, what makes up well-being, then these are just going to be whatever those things are that fundamentally make my life go better for me.
Okay.
Now, so far, that's probably not all that helpful. So I want to give one way in which some philosophers have tried to elucidate the concept of well-being, which I think is quite a bit more helpful, even though it's not exactly a definition, if I can give you that. So this is what's been called the crib test. So you're supposed to imagine you're a parent and you're standing over your newborn baby's crib. For those listeners who have never been parents, imagine another person who you deeply love and care about, who you're looking after. I think it should go without saying in this case that you're going to want or should want whatever is best for your child, right? So then if you're going to think about the kind of life you would like your child to have, what are the kinds of things you think about? So what are the things that you think would constitute a good life for this tiny little being that you love so much? I think that's probably as good a method as we have for sort of zeroing in on the actual content of this idea of well-being, is to think about someone you deeply love and care about. What do you want for their sake or out of concern for them?
So in terms of understanding one's own well-being, it's also about looking at how they treat somebody you deeply care about, as like I said, the crib test, where it's the baby of a parent. So that's one way to look at it. So is that right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the best ways, I think, of just getting a handle on what it is we're talking about when we talk about well-being. So far, that leaves the question of what well-being actually is, and what are the constituents of well-being unanswered. So there are lots of different theories about that as well. Philosophers disagree about that.
Well, moving on from theories or the definition, I think we've gotten a broad idea of what it encompasses or what it entails. But what are the factors which are involved in a person being well? Like, let's just take any random XYZ person, for example. How do you define or describe that person? What are the factors affecting that person from being well or not?
Yeah. So again, philosophers have different views about this. There are three main views in the philosophical literature. The first is what's called hedonism. You may have heard this term before. So what hedonism to a philosopher means is the view that the only thing that makes a person's life go well is pleasure.
Okay.
Or if you like, you can call it happiness, but positive mental states. Feeling good is what matters in how well your life is going. And then the only thing that is bad for you is if you feel bad, you feel pain, or you suffer. So that is sort of the first major theory that philosophers have put forward about well-being. The second major theory is what's called the desire fulfillment theory. As you might expect from the name, what this theory says is that what is good for you is just to get whatever it is that you desire. So if we're thinking about how well is your life going, we just have to look at the extent to which you are getting what you want, basically. If you are successful in achieving most of the things that you desire, or attaining most of the things that you desire, then you're leading a good life, a successful life.
So it's like you set up goals, and then every time you achieve those goals, it means like, okay, you're getting happier with those goals, and so in terms of well-being.
Yeah. So wanting something and then getting that thing basically is well-being on that view. And the last theory is what's called the objective list theory. And this is the view that there are some things that are good for all human beings, maybe just because of the nature of human beings or something like this. So, whether or not you get pleasure from it or you desire it, something like achievement or friendship, or virtue. Some philosophers will think moral virtue itself is one of the things that goes to make up your well-being. So the idea here is that there's some list of goods that upholds for every person. And some philosophers in recent years have proposed what are called hybrid theories, which combine one or more elements from those sort of classical three theories. That is actually the kind of theory that I've been trying to develop and defend, is a kind of hybrid theory of well-being. But I want to add that although there is this wide swath of disagreement about what the actual sort of fundamental constituents of well-being are, there is a lot of agreement among philosophers about at least some of the societal or environmental preconditions for well-being. So, things that people need in order to achieve well-being, whatever it might end up being.
Okay.
So think about, for instance, a person living in abject poverty.
Okay.
So on any of the theories I've just gone through, or probably any plausible theory of well-being, it's going to be very difficult for someone who's living in horrible conditions of poverty to live a life that is high in well-being. Why? Because they don't have the resources or the time to engage in the kind of things that give them pleasure, or to pursue the fulfillment of their desires, or objective, valuable things like friendship and achievements. The same thing, I think, can be said about people living under oppressive social conditions, which don't allow them to make autonomous decisions about their own life. On whatever theory of well-being you have, I think it's very plausible that some degree of freedom to choose how you're going to live is necessary to attain a high level of well-being, or at least in most cases is going to be a precondition for achieving well-being. And the last thing I want to note is that any theory of well-being is going to take physical health to be incredibly important to well-being. That's most relevant, I think, to the current context. The only disagreement that philosophers really have is health just sort of a precondition for well-being? That is, it something that you need in order to get pleasure, or whatever it is that's actually fundamentally good for you, or is it itself a constituent of well-being? And some philosophers think this. So some people will put on their list of goods, physical health or mental health or something like this.
So I think you made an interesting point there, in the sense like, positivity is the thing. In order to remain positive, you have to generate positivity by yourself. I think that's an interesting takeaway from that. And how I want to know how that affects the other person. So does your well-being, how much does it impact another person? Or if you're not well, let's say just a close one, or not even a close, even a stranger, how does your well-being or not being well affect that person?
Yeah, so I think our well-being is actually interconnected in a lot of different ways with that of other people. And I think this is something that philosophers probably should have spent more time talking about explicitly than they have. So I'm glad to see you raising this. I think maybe there are some obvious ways, I guess, in which our well-being affects others. So certainly, like, go back to the crib test, right? Seems plausible if we're thinking about the well-being of the parent in that situation, that's going to be probably significantly affected by how well their child's life goes.
Right.
But that doesn't just hold for a parent and a child. Think just about how much your own mood is affected by whether your friends or your loved ones are flourishing, or are doing well, or are struggling. Right? I think if we're most of us, at least, maybe not all of us, there are always exceptions. I think most human beings we can't help but feel empathy for other people, particularly those people who are closest to us, even when, feeling that empathy is going to make us feel unhappy or bad. It might even be, decrease our well-being because we see others suffering, and that makes us suffer. But I think, that's just part of what it is to be a human being. There are limits, of course, to how far that empathy can extend, and I think that's certainly a morally relevant topic in itself, because maybe we need to think about how we can extend, our empathetic capacities more broadly than we usually do. But if we just think about those people who surround us, who we see every day, most of us actually care how they're doing, and I think that ends up affecting our well-being. There's also, I think, just a kind of emotional contagion effect that exists, that sort of, seeing people happy makes us often feel better, and especially if they're people we care about. And what's more, many people at least believe that being a morally good person is a constituent of well-being. So I mentioned that sort of view when I talked about objectivist views. But so Aristotle, maybe the most famous and influential ethicist in philosophical history, famously thought that well-being consists to a large extent in being a morally virtuous person.
Okay.
So if we hold that sort of view, or even think that sort of view is somewhat plausible, then living a life that's good for you, Pranit, even from a sort of purely self-interested perspective. So, say you're a complete egoist, living a life that is actually good for you, that makes your life go well, is going to require you to actually, care about other people and promote their well-being.
Okay. So sometimes it's good to look out for others, is what you're trying to say, in essence.
Yes, I mean, even if you're an egoist, I think there are arguments to be made that you should care a lot about other people.
But I
I
love
think
the
it could be
distinction.
egoist, but
But I love the distinction in your answer for everything you said. You said most people or many people, never all.
yeah. Well, unfortunately, right? I mean, if we think about so-called, psychopaths, they're often characterized as, lacking empathy, and that seems to be at least one of the deficits that they have, and why they don't seem to obey the moral rules that most of us obey. So I do think empathy is very important for ethics, both in thinking about well-being, but just in general. This is not an uncontroversial point because some ethicists have recently come out against empathy. That is actually the title of a recent book. But I'm on the pro-empathy side.
Okay. So I did not know. So wait a minute. There's a book about not being empathetic and how that's good.
Yeah. It's a book by this fellow Paul Bloom, and I mean it's based on the fact that, like I already mentioned, our capacities for empathy are very limited, and our empathy tends to be very partial. We are able to empathize with those close to us and those we have certain relationships with, but that isn't. If we think in terms of sort of what's fair, if we think morality requires treating everyone equally, then you might think, well, if we don't empathize with everyone equally, so whatever empathy is, it can't be the basis of morality because it isn't impartial in the way morality should be.
Right. But that's actually an interesting point. I'm pretty sure it's a new thing. But I guess the point you made about empathy being partial, I guess we as creatures are partial. Like any stance we take is always been subjective based on what best suits us or the people closest to us. I think that's the takeaway from that. But then we come to this year, when even the people closest to us are separated, and we are isolated a lot, especially for the past 3-4 months, and only now we're slowly trying to get back. And that put a lot of strain on people, mentally speaking. It really affect their well-being, in my opinion. Yeah. How much do you think this social isolation has affected a person's wellness?
So yeah, I think it's had a huge effect. Really, I think this crisis has had a disastrous impact on, I think, the overall quality of life for the majority of people worldwide. And I think that that's going to be true regardless of what your particular view about well-being is, because people are not getting as many pleasures as they used to. They're not satisfying as many desires, and they're not getting they're not able to spend time with their friends, right? And most of us who think that they're objective goods think friendship, having social connections with others is a very important element of well-being.
So I do think Netflix and chill is not the answer.
Yeah. So I think, the most obvious way in which it's true that the disease has had a horrible effect is that recently the death toll worldwide crossed 1 million. I don't know if you saw that story. And that's just a staggering number. And whatever we think about well-being, death cuts us off from all those good things that life has to offer, right? Death deprives us of a future of pleasure, of achievement, of desire, satisfaction. Setting aside whether maybe some people believe in an afterlife, which might complicate things, but if generally we think, right, that death is the greatest harm that can befall a person because it prevents them from enjoying any future good things.
Right.
So I think another case, though, many people still alive are grieving for people they've lost that passed away well before their time. Lots of people have lost their only source of income. If we think about daily wage workers in Ahmedabad, for example, but a lot of other places. So where I am right now in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada, there's been a huge increase in opioid overdose deaths since COVID-19 hit. It's been the worst we've had the worst few months, or at least I think June was the worst month we've had historically in terms of number of people who suffered from opioid overdoses. So that was already a crisis going on, but it's been exacerbated, made worse by COVID because of the increased isolation of these people. Again, I mean, many people with existing mental health issues have found these exacerbated. Even if you didn't previously suffer from depression or mental illness, I think there's quite a few people who have had their first experience of this, unfortunately, during this period. Also, if you look at rates of domestic abuse, for instance, they've gone way up since the lockdown and the general social distancing. So it does seem very much like the social isolation is giving rise to a lot of very concerning trends in terms of especially those who were already very vulnerable, and situations that there were already various moral crises that our world is suffering from. But it just seems like all of these have been made worse or have been sort of sharpened by this current year.
Yeah, that's exactly why I want to talk about this topic of being well, because as we've well established by now that positivity is what generates you being well, and it's a cycle. You being well will create more positivity, and your positivity creates you being better. But in this situation where the world is dying for some positivity, like people literally want that ray of hope, of that sunshine, and when you don't get that, it affects you in many other ways as well, not just in terms of health, but also in terms of your ethical values. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing I really wanted to talk about in this episode, is that how does you not being well affect your moral code, your moral values, which you set for yourself for so many years?
Yeah. So I think that's a fascinating question, and it's one that there actually has been, I think, a decent amount of research on in recent years. So it does seem that our ethical behavior, or I guess how ethical our behavior is influenced by a wide variety of factors, including our own current mental states or our mood. So there have been various studies suggesting, for instance, that people tend to behave much more altruistically. So they're more willing to go out of their way to benefit others, to help others when they're in a positive mood. So you're feeling good, and that somehow plays a large role in determining whether you're going to go out of your way to help another person. When people feel, by contrast, like their own well-being is under threat, or they're suffering, they seem to become less considerate of others, or at least there's various studies that suggest this. And in both of those cases, so whether you're feeling good or you're feeling bad, there's some evidence that the behavior, so that the positive ethical, the good ethical behavior or the bad ethical behavior, and the good or bad mental state are sort of mutually reinforcing. So if you have a positive mental state, you're in a good mood. This tends to make you behave more altruistically. But there's also evidence to suggest that behaving altruistically helps to improve people's mood. So behaving altruistically then helps improve your mood, which then makes you behave more altruistically. So there's a positive sort of cycle or network. On the other hand, the opposite holds, right? So you're feeling bad, and that makes you more selfish and less concerned about others, it seems like in many cases, because you're so focused on your own suffering or the threat to your own well-being. So that makes you behave immorally, which makes you feel worse, which makes you behave less morally, and so on. So actually, there's a philosopher called Michael Bishop who actually has written a book on well-being where he focuses very much on these sort of networks, causal networks, he calls, of different sort of mental states, different environmental factors. And he thinks that well-being is fundamentally about sort of building up the right kind of loop of, first you have one positive state, and then once you sort of start from a good place, hopefully, you can sort of build a positive cycle. But of course, things can also go very badly given that, because you start from a bad place, you end up in a bad place. Garbage in, garbage out, sort of.
But that also brings me to one question, especially I think this answer is needed for people now watching this. In the sense like, it's human nature for us to get into those bad cycles. Yeah, we do something bad by mistake or even without knowing it. And especially now it's easier to get into those cycles. but how does one break out of it?
Hmm. That is a hard question, I think, and I think maybe it's a question, that is better asked of, a life coach than myself as a philosopher of well-being. I mean, I can do my best and try to give my own suggestions. I think, trying to find those things that you are passionate about, that you love, and sort of all make sure you spend time, try to save time, cut out time every day to do those activities or to enjoy those things. Of course, this can be very difficult when you're, locked in your house, especially if the things you're passionate about, include a lot of things that require you to go outside. But I think, finding things to be passionate about, and, finding things that you think that you care about, that seem to you to give life meaning. I mean, that's what you have to try to do. But get a solution to, how to do that when you're not feeling like life has meaning or like there's anything that's worth being passionate about. I can't give an answer to how to get out of that sort of cycle. I know I myself sort of have had struggles with that, with sort of mental health and depression and getting into a positive mental state. So I think, it's not something that a philosopher can just tell you, be happy or achieve your desires or, make more friends, and then you're going to go out and have a solution. So I think oftentimes, many of us need a lot of help from, we need to go talk to someone, a counselor or something. So I would recommend that, certainly, for people who are finding themselves in sort of a negative causal loop. But that's maybe the best I can do.
Yeah, but only if, like, if only it was so easy to say, do this, you'll be all right. If only it was so easy. But the reason I want to preface this by saying the next question by saying the reason why I asked those two previous questions is because, yes, it's a pandemic, and 2020 has been weird in the sense when there's a pandemic, people should be more afraid, and they were afraid. But then there was an uprising of social justice issues, not just in America, but even in India and various other countries for various issues. People going out in the streets protesting during a pandemic, and while I applaud them, but it also made me question, these issues were prevalent even before this year. Isn't something which started now. Yeah. But people are taking this moment to stand up against it. So that's why I wanted to ask about, does this have an effect on their reason to stand up right now? Is the reason their mental state or their well-being? Is that a reason?
Yeah, maybe. I think so. I would really like to believe that sort of this current crisis is going to have the effect of waking people up to, a lot of the social evils that we've let go, unnoticed or unremarked upon or unprotested against, if you like, for so long. Because, like you're saying, a lot of these things, these problems have existed for a very long time and have for too long been ignored. And maybe this will help pave the way for a more just world. I would say, unfortunately, I'm not entirely optimistic about that. And the reason for this is because I think although we have seen, this pandemic bring out the best in some people, people have been banding together in solidarity against these common threats and trying to help the most vulnerable. I think we've seen a lot of generosity and selflessness, but we've also seen, I think, the opposite. Unfortunately, we've seen many people remain unwilling to wear non-surgical masks, for instance, even though this is not a huge sacrifice on their part. And all the evidence suggests that, if everyone did this, it would significantly curtail the spread of the disease. Again, in many countries, we've seen a real resurgence of kind of nationalistic or even sort of flat out racist thinking, sort of, a protectionist sort of idea that sort of, it's the foreigners who are responsible for this. And, we need to take care of ourselves, and it's every country for itself. Maybe the most extreme example of this is what's been called vaccine nationalism. So I don't know if you've heard this term or heard about this issue, but so as you are no doubt aware, so as of now, right, we don't have a safe and effective vaccine for COVID-19, but many of the richer countries have already been entering into these very lucrative so-called pre-purchase agreements with the pharmaceutical companies, the ones that are working on all these various different candidate vaccines. And the thinking here, right, is that they want to get first crack at the vaccine, if it turns out one of these actually, is safe and effective. And some of these administrations, so the most notable example is the Trump administration in the United States, have been completely open and unapologetic about the fact that their intention is, first of all, vaccinate every American. So if we get the vaccine, or we have an agreement with the vaccine producer, first of all, every American gets this, regardless of whether they're, high risk, or regardless of whether they're, on the front line healthcare workers or things like this, just every American. And only then are we going to think about any non-Americans.
But does that, I want to interject here, but does that play into the fact that where we mentioned at the beginning that empathetic, or rather doing something good for people, is partial? Mm-hmm. Maybe that patriotism, is that playing into that self of, I'm helping my people, so that makes me feel good? Yeah,
I think so. There are many who think that, some degree of partiality towards, the members of your own nation is justified. And I think if you're working in government, I think it's clear that some degree of partiality towards the members of your own state is probably justified. But I think it's the extent of what we're seeing, this idea that, first of all, every American should get this, regardless of whether they're at significant risk. And only then, people in other countries who are at great risk are going to get it. So, I mean, there have also been people pushing back against this. So there is a worldwide effort going on right now, between the World Health Organization and some other nonprofits that is trying to create sort of a worldwide agreement that will counter this threat of vaccine nationalism. But the unfortunate thing is, so far they've had limited success at getting the rich countries on board. So the US hasn't signed up and many other countries haven't. Now, I do think that there have been positives about this. So maybe, I don't want to come off seeming over completely pessimistic. I do definitely think that the pandemic has really forced a lot of us to think about, or it's forced to the surface, a lot of issues, a lot of tensions that those of us, like I imagine most people who are watching this interview, who are at least somewhat privileged, we've gone to university, we have the ability to some extent, social isolate and things like this. Or sort of social distance and things like this. But it's forced us to think about things that we previously sort of have had the luxury of ignoring. Because I think that's one of the ways, maybe the most basic way in which privilege functions, is that, if something doesn't affect you, it can be easy to bury your head in the sand. And I think what's happened is these things that previously didn't affect us, and so we didn't have to think about them, we're now being forced to confront and think about. And I think, probably it's the case, and that the sort of the global order that we are living under was already, ethically indefensible and sort of unsustainable going forward, before COVID-19, before we even heard of COVID-19. And I guess what I hope, and I'm not sure this will be the case, but what I hope is that sort of once the crisis has to some extent passed, so we're back to normal, whatever normal is going to be, that we don't lose sight of the facts that the world is, in a lot of ways, broken. Yeah. So there's a philosopher called Tim Mulligan who has a book called Ethics for a Broken World. And I think, maybe we've been forced to confront the fact that we've been living in a broken world, a world that has a lot of, things that have just completely, systems that are just not functioning in a way that anyone can defend morally, or that are even practically sustainable in the long term. And I think if it's true, as I think it is, that we are living already in a broken world, then we need to, adapt, and our ethics needs to reflect that. And so I guess my greatest hope about this sort of pandemic is that it will have a sort of enduring change, or cause an enduring change in outlook. But again, I think we haven't seen just positive things; we've also seen negative things, and whether there's a sense in which that we can, say some good things came out of this horrible situation, is still to be discovered, I think.
Well, I think all we can do is hope, and I think that's the best part of humanity is we always hope for the best, and I believe in that. You hope for the best, and hopefully that will lead to positive things, and in turn make you better.
I think, I agree completely with that. I think there's a tradition in sort of Christian ethics, according to which sort of despair is seen as, in some ways, sort of the greatest sin. It's sort of, despair is the worst thing, the thing you most need to guard against. And I think we maybe shouldn't blame people for falling into despair, especially in the current situation. But I think maybe we should think about, do we, morally speaking, have the luxury of despairing, given, how bad things are for so many people right now? Don't we have an obligation to instead, do whatever we can to improve things, rather than just, looking at how bad things are and allowing it to crush our spirits? Don't we owe it to, those who are the worst off, to at least, try to maintain some hope, try to maintain some idea that
try to bring them up
we can progress and we can, improve the situation. There probably always will be evil in the world, but we can at least do what we can to, make it so that there's less evil.
Yeah, but I guess that's the thing which people are, I hope, are realizing during this pandemic, in the sense people who are watching this video, most of us out here, we're in very much a sense protected compared to a lot of people actually much drastically suffered more than any of us. So I'm not saying what we've gone through is less. I don't want to undermine anybody who's gone through problems during this pandemic who are privileged as well, but it's also important to recognize where we are and where others are as well. And hey, you help them, you feel good for yourself as well. I guess that's the...
Yeah, I think that is an important thing to remember as well, is that, there are also selfish reasons to try to maintain hope and to try to actually go out and, take various positive steps. I know it's hard sometimes to know what to do when there are so many problems out there, but there are little things you can do to try to make the world a better place, I think.
Little things for others and for your own well-being. I think that should be the takeaway from this interview. Well, sir.
Yeah, of course. I think, I think if you lose sight of your own well-being and you lose sight of, you need to make sure you're taking care of yourself. I think especially at this current time, I think self-care has become even harder than it usually is, but it's fundamentally, I think, an important thing, ethically important as well as, good for you.
Like I said, if not for selfless reasons, for selfish reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always good to sort of hedge your bets, right?
Yeah.
If you're not convinced by this argument, then here's another sort of argument.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, make sure everyone is good at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, that was a wonderful talk on well-being and how it affects us morally and how positivity is the key. And if you're in one of those bad cycles, please do try to break out of it. And so, thank you, sir, for taking your time to talk with me about this, talk with us about this.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. I think having this conversation with you enhanced my well-being significantly. I wish you all the best, and thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. Now that concludes the interview. Now, I want to make one thing clear. Please try to have some positivity. And I know it's easier said than done. And because the reason I'm saying this is once you get into that cycle, as mentioned in the interview, of doing something selfish or doing something bad, even by mistake, it's hard to come out of it. And especially when we're not meeting out with our friends or family on a day-to-day basis outside, it's difficult, man. And I get, again, saying it might be easier than done, but try. And like I said in the interview, one can always hope for the best. And in terms of your well-being, the more you look out for others, the better you are as a human being and the better you are at being well. And I'd like to end on that note. So seeing as though you're very charitable at this moment after me saying that, do like, share and subscribe. And if you did not like the video, Well then, just do like, share and subscribe because you are a generous soul. Thank you so much.